You get control of the IT, you use LLMs, and you can very rapidly synthesize whatever information you need and get it. And a very small team of people can do that. That may inevitably mean a shift from the bureaucratic form to the monarchical form, where a strong executive is going to be able to control what remains a very, very large-scale organization and do so with more agility and more power. There's very clear advantages to very small teams of people who can operate decisively and quickly. The greatest founders of our era are going to be drawn to these questions. Like, these are questions of profound importance. At New Founding, our primary focus is the private sector. But our thesis across the board is that more and more of the opportunities, more and more of the institutions that shape the future of our society will be distributed. They'll either be at the private sector or they'll be at the state and local level. And the state level is a particularly interesting one because in some sense, it's a bet on the rise of institutions that for really probably at least 150 years, we're seeing diminished power. Federalism was a sort of a popular mantra of the principled conservative crowd for a long time. People like to talk about how theoretically great we should have states' rights, we should have states are different experiments. Practically speaking, the macro forces were running against that. Like that was inevitably going to be a losing proposition at a time when so many of the macro forces were toward globalism, were toward sort of large centralized bureaucratic institutions. And so I think it was more the mantra of people who were sort of idealistically talking about something theoretical rather than something that was a practical realm for opportunity. I think that really very clearly starting with the COVID era, that changed. And it was very clear that states were actually domains that mattered. And I think that wasn't just an anomaly during COVID. What I think that reflected is I think it reflected this sort of systemic shift as we see this disruption of the centralized institutions. We see the disruptive forces of the digital age shaking at the power and unity of centralized institutional forces in a way that creates a void that allows states to rise, allows private players to rise. Very, very clear example would be Musk and buying Twitter and really building that into a very prominent force that sort of crosses politics and touches all the layers of society. But another one is the opportunity of red states and especially assertive red state governors to rise. And I think the key to think about, and this is, one analogy is in the sort of decline of empire. In the wake of empire, you'd see this with the Soviet Union, for instance. There's an opportunity. You have a legal opportunity now for the different states to step up, but it's not necessarily going to happen. It's not guaranteed to happen. So you had some that just sort of, they actually saw a diminished standard of living. They saw a reduction of economic activity, and there's others that jumped up and really grabbed the opportunity to chart their own course in a way that was very positive. I think we'll see the same thing to some extent at the state level, where states increasingly have the opportunity to step up. A key point to keep in mind is not just a legal opportunity. It's not just a legal matter. You could have the Supreme Court pass some ruling that reasserts 10th Amendment doctrines in a way that gives states more power. But if their financial system remains, if they lack a financial system, if they remain dependent on Wall Street, they remain in some ways a sort of financial colony of BlackRock or of Goldman Sachs or whatever. If digitally they have very little control over their destiny, and they remain a digital colony of Google or whatever, they're not really sovereign in a meaningful sense. They're not in a position to chart their course and to sort of take advantage of that greater legal ability. So we're in a moment where the opportunity is arising. There are reductions in centralized power, but to actually realize that you need leaders, you need ambitious leaders with vision to actually pursue that and to build and strengthen the institutions that enable that. So I'm excited about this because it brings something that's been a central theme of New Founding since the start into a new domain, which is state level politics. It's a new organization. It's called the State Leadership Initiative. I'm a co-founding board member of it. So it's not something that's as significant as our direct businesses at New Founding in terms of our involvement. It has amazing founder who's leading it, very, very capable. But it's an expression of our vision in a new space. And so it will be an organization that both helps develop that vision. So often at the state level, what you see very small-minded politicians who really are often just using that even as a stepping stone to get to the federal level, which historically has been where the opportunity was, where the sort of the decisions that mattered were made. We want to help craft not just sort of technocratic policy reforms at the state level, but ambitious visions that they can aspire to, and they can really animate a whole range of reforms. Then we can, through that vision, we can develop what a lot of policy changes would look like. And then finally, how do we actually channel people into roles that matter to actually realize that? How do we orchestrate collective action at the state level? And certainly that can cross the public and the private domain. If you want an alternative to ESG, if you want to develop a financial system that really serves the state well, that serves the people of that state, or really the sort of people and culture of that region, what does that look like? And how do we actually build the institutional strength in a way that's independent? And this organization is going to play a central role in actually defining what that looks like and helping orchestrate the action needed to actually create some of those new institutions and strengthen them.
That's great. I read a tweet recently, I think it was Nick Carter who tweeted that one of the key things or interesting things that Doge had achieved was making government roles an aspirational, like desirable role again for young men. Do you envision something like this? Like one of the outcomes of the state leadership initiative would be young, ambitious men want to, some might want to found companies that we end up backing through new founding, but others may want to actually join in at the state political sort of apparatus level to shape the policy, the direction of Texas or Nevada. Is that something that you would envision?
Absolutely. And I actually think that's the only way to achieve this. In a sense, you need an entrepreneurial sort of founder level mindset applied to this thing because they're not following a course that exists. Really, the way I would sum it up is we need a vision of statesmanship at the state level. Mm-hmm. State, so often, as I said, has been sort of mundane, technocratic, trading political favors, whatever. There's a skill, there's an art to that. Absolutely. That can't just disappear. But can that be combined with statesman-like vision? And I actually think there's sort of an interesting element about the Doge that applies. It certainly applies to the state level, applies to government generally. In many ways, this is the appeal of moving beyond a managerial regime. And a managerial regime is just not appealing. Anything if your government institutions are almost always managerial bureaucracies, and really even Congress to a large extent was just a bunch of people who played a role in the administration of those bureaucracies. I mean, one way to look at it is the committees in Congress were committees that helped oversee administrative agencies. These were not legislatures of the sort who were part of the American founding who are crafting real laws. They are in a sense sort of auxiliary administrators and policy setters. That's not exciting. That just doesn't appeal. That doesn't appeal to men looking to build something or achieve something. You move beyond managerial bureaucracy. You move into a space where politics can be really, there's an art of the possible there. What can we achieve? What are the powers of this? What is this institution positioned to achieve? Let's go do it. That's going to appeal. That's going to appeal to just a different caliber of person, the same sort of person who might go into the private sector, especially might go into a really, really ambitious startup, like one that is focusing on these sort of civilizational questions. And I think that those, certainly you'll see those at the federal level. Really, I think a lot of that at the federal level is still going to have to be primarily cutting, which is exciting, but it's also limiting in what you can do. At the state level, I could see a world where you have people who really spend 30 years at the state level just building political capital, compounding and stewarding it, building really a political machine, which is often a dirty word. And I think that there's ways to, I'm using that in a very broad sense, but they accrue political power, build a network, they remain at that state level, and they use it to just build an entire array of institutions across the state. Think of like Robert Moses as an example of this in New York, where it's just someone who throughout a career across a number of different sectors just saw as a legacy just building a set of institutions, a set of real physical world projects that transformed a city and transformed an area. And whether you like or dislike how he approached it, I think that it's people like that. I mean, they say with Augustus, I think he arrived in a city of brick and he left a city of marble. And so there's room for people with an ambitious vision to accomplish things at the state level over a period of decades that parallel the impact of some of the greatest entrepreneurial ventures.
Yeah, that's cool. I mean, partly it's like you said, I think that the efforts of Doge are great to see at the national level, but the outcomes will be pushing stuff back to the states. And if the states remain hyper managerial, bureaucratic, you're missing out on the opportunity to build, like, essentially attack the problem from both sides.
Exactly.
Yeah. So we talked about Doge a little bit. I think we're 4 weeks into the new admin. Feels like 4 years, just given the amount of stuff that's been happening. What are some of your kind of like key takeaways from the first 3 weeks of Trump? Executive orders that stand out to you, moves that were surprising. What's caught your eye that you think important to flag about the direction or the doors that are open now for the next decade?
I mean, first point I like is I think we're only 2.5 weeks in at the time of this recording, which is striking. I mean,
it feels like 4 weeks.
It's hard to conceive of how much has happened in that 2.5 weeks. Yeah. But it's from where I was out there. I was there in DC during it, so I remember it, and it's striking. I mean, I think it's
What was the energy like when you were there?
The energy was incredible. I mean, even the inauguration itself. We weren't physically able to attend because of the weather ostensibly. It doesn't matter. It was very clear that it was a new era there, running into people, the center of our people there, optimism, things happening, things being rolled out at a very rapid clip. Like, I do not in any way want to diminish what's happening there. And I do think that there will be some great achievements at the federal level too. There might be some great things in foreign policy. There certainly will be new projects. I still think in some there will be a lot more cutting than there will be building. So I don't want to diminish the prospect of the federal domain as a landscape, and particularly for the next few years, being there and being at the center of massive change will set the stage for any number of things. But really, I think that still, they are dealing with enormous bureaucracies. They are dealing with enormous challenges, and in many ways, those problems are going to be shorter term problems. I think that it will be a world historical accomplishment to sort of peacefully, let's call it, suppress and roll back the managerial regime.
Sure.
Because I think that the downside scenario was a scenario that you may be seeing in Europe. I'm not sure how this plays out, but sort of Europe is certainly further along, where it's sort of a death by ice, where you just sort of this regime retains a grip on society in a way that just squeezes out entrepreneurial opportunity, squeezes out the opportunity for change, and really squeezes the life out of society. And I think that was one scenario, that sort of a totalitarian grip, that was one scenario that really worried me. Like, the longer I knew that regime was doomed, but a doomed regime can continue for a long, long time and can really drag the country down with it a ways. So I think the real accomplishment is, and there could have been different ways out of that, some of which might have been far more violent. So anytime you have sort of a phase change like that, you have an expectation that there's going to be major conflict in any transition. The fact that Trump was able to win, and the fact that they're able to go in there and they're able to pretty rapidly scale these things back and really diminish their ability to lash out as power is taken away from them, as really sort of digital trends inevitably cause them to lose power, is it's really a remarkable accomplishment of statecraft. Yeah. I think of the sovereign individual. I've cited this one. Sovereign individual had the prediction that it was the most developed societies that would most violently resist the transition they describe. I don't agree with sort of every part of their thesis about what the transition looks like, but I did buy into the thesis that the most developed ones have the most to lose in many ways. You have the most developed, let's say, large managerial bureaucracies. To see them lose power, to see them stripped of many of the elements that protected them, they gave them resources, you can expect that they both have the highest state capacity to resist that, and they have the highest incentive to resist that. So what you're seeing to some extent, and I want to be wary, I think that government efficiency is a risk. There's been some astute commentators who pointed out that making these things more efficient doesn't actually diminish their power. It may actually increase their power. So I think that what we're doing is we're certainly seeing a cut in the entrenched interests that are going to resist many of the changes. You do still have probably very effective institutions that may resist certain changes down the road. At the same time, given the people who are involved, I think they're probably going to pare back particularly pare back aspects of them that would resist sort of changes that come in the digital age. Right. So I think that what you're seeing is a sort of almost a miracle of statecraft to make that happen. And I really attribute that to a large extent to the American spirit. Like on the one hand, you have those incentives that strongly favor the strongest resistance to change, but you also have a spirit that fundamentally is drawn to that entrepreneurial and just has a vitality and a life. You saw during stronger resistance to COVID and all sorts of things. Sure. That I think makes it expected that we would be the country to raise up a leader who would actually be able to accomplish this move electorally rather than
right. The American man is drawn to like the new paradigms, like
yes,
the invention of aircraft, the getting to the moon, all these things. And so they're new frontiers, and so there's at least an expectation, an ethos, a track record of going to the frontier and conquering it.
Yeah, and I would say self-government too.
Sure.
I mean, the fact that we have a tradition of self-government, there's still an expectation that we can take control of these bureaucracies. But it's in our heritage to take control and to separate from them, to check them, rather than to necessarily have to submit to them.
Birthright is the word.
Yes, our birthright. It is a birthright as Americans to step up and make that happen.
Right.
In the first 2.5 weeks, the progress has been rapid enough that it feels like the bureaucracy has been sort of stunned, disoriented. Do you see that continuing, or do you think there's still some level of more significant either bureaucratic resistance or violence or anything else that could arise in the transition?
So I'll zoom back to a little bit more macro level, but I think that's I don't know the specific dynamics in the DC bureaucracies. At the macro level, I don't think bureaucracies are well suited to address this pace. They're slow moving organizations. Sure. So speed is actually one of the surest ways to defeat them. And speed, historically, I think you saw bureaucracies arise, and really you saw the managerial age arise, an age that is dominated by a managerial elite, because the winning organization, the winning form in terms of institutional and geopolitical competition required very large scale, and only managerial bureaucracies could operate at that very large scale. And so naturally you're going to see a managerial, and really one person cannot centrally control organizations that large given the technology of the previous era. So what you necessarily saw was the rise of a bureaucratic class. There's a lot of costs associated with that. Far slower moving, far more conflict in terms of will. You need much more bureaucratic consensus. There's very clear advantages to very small teams of people who can operate decisively and quickly. And in any sort of competition where the bureaucratic scale does not give you an insurmountable advantage, you actually expect the small teams to beat the large bureaucratic organizations. You expect an agile organization to beat a more sclerotic organization. What's striking, I think, about some of the new digital technologies, AI is a great one, where they can rapidly, with LLMs, they can sort of rapidly assess huge amounts of information, which normally you require large bureaucracies to get to you, really need to be filtered through bureaucrats. I mean, the first Trump administration, one of the central ways they stymied him was they just refused to give information, or they would give information that was very selective. Well, now you get control of the IT, you use LLMs, and you can very rapidly synthesize whatever information you need and get it. And a very small team of people can do that. So now you have
of Zoomers.
Yes. So now you have, and I've long said that actually that may inevitably mean a shift from the bureaucratic form to the monarchical form, where a monarch, a single executive, a strong executive, is going to be able to control what remains a very, very large scale organization, and do so with more agility and more power, essentially, than a similar sized bureaucracy. And in that world, the monarch wins in any conflict with the bureaucratic class. So I think there's this, and look, that's a provocative thing to say here. Monarch, of course, seems scary in America. I don't think that's out of our tradition at all. John Adams specifically said that the American presidency was effectively crafted in many ways as a sort of elective monarch, obviously a monarch with the checks of electoral change. But he saw that as a position that had a level of authority that was greater than a large share of the monarchs in Europe at the time. It was less than, I think there were only 1, 2, maybe 3 monarchs in Europe who actually had more power than the US president. So it's actually within our tradition to recognize that a strong executive is central, and it's actually a strong means of the electorate imposing their control over a permanent bureaucracy. So I think that in theory there's any number of things that could cause the bureaucracy to strike back. But I think that the sort of macro trends, the sort of global historical technological trends, are against them. And as long as this pace continues, they don't have the ability to react like that. Now, what succeeds them, the left isn't just going to give up. So what succeeds them is another question. But I don't think that the sort of classic, I don't think we'll see sort of internal bureaucratic resistance that is sufficient to fight back, provided the sort of will remains. And I don't really see why the will would change.
Yeah, we can talk about the new threats here in a minute, but I just want to make a comment. So Eric, when you talked about the LLMs and the executive, Eric Prince has this great line where he talks about like the role of a military commander is to gather information and release energy. And if an LLM allows the executive, the military commander, to essentially speed up that like information collecting phase, then yeah, they can. Someone like a Trump, someone like a Musk can release energy so much faster.
They're incredible at releasing energy. Whereas you think of the sort of general class, the class of in the military space, right? The generals in charge of the military for the last 20 years, those are not a class of people who are releasing energy.
Right. Yeah. So what do you think? And this kind of goes to even shifts in, let's say, tech. So a lot of people in tech are now, at least, there's been people who've been on the right or right leaning for a long time, and they've been there early. There's a lot of people who are shifting, maybe because the power is shifting, where it seems like where wokeness and managerialism were the threats of the previous era, let's call it. Those are disappearing, but we're not entering into an era of just rainbows and flowers. What do you see as the new threats, the new challenges that arise from both the political wins we've achieved, but also the new layout of the chessboard, as it were?
Yeah, so it's interesting. In some sense, I would say the parties are less ideological in a sense. So really, it was this realignment. It was very easy to foresee in a sense. For me, the sort of left was inevitably becoming the managerial left.
Right.
The Democratic Party was inevitably the sort of managerial party.
Harris was like the ultimate manager.
Exactly. Well, or not, because in a managerial regime, you actually don't even need an executive. So in some sense, sort of an empty, Biden and Harris are both the sort of perfect executives for the managerial regime, because they're not going to do anything. They're going to leave it to the bureaucratic class to do their thing.
Sure.
In many ways, I think that inevitably what you saw was that class was trying to grab onto power, was trying to retain power in the face of technological disruption, which was going to require it to resist disruptive change, which meant that inevitably the first Trump movement was a set of enemies of that sort of expert managerial class, particularly the sort of middle American business owners, people, just individual Americans who were really didn't gain much from it and often lost significantly from it. It was natural to me that many people in the tech world would also move into that, because all of those are enemies of the managerial regime. They're all going to have opposing interests to a managerial regime that is desperately trying to grasp power and prevent change. So you have this new coalition, but it's not super ideological. So what that leaves is, I think it leaves a sort of legacy Democratic legacy Democratic Party, Democratic regime, which I would call sort of longhoused managerial bureaucracy. It's a longhoused progressive egalitarian managerial bureaucracy, right? It's very safetyist. It's very bureaucratic in its nature. It has a sort of fundamentally leftist ethos to it, but it's characterized by those first traits.
Sure.
I don't really see that regaining power. I don't think it has the vitality to gain power. I mean, one of the things that's striking is you see just screenshots shared from some of the groups they're in, and they're continually sending around things about self-care and really just sort of a therapeutic mindset. And that is not going to be the mindset that beats Elon Musk. It's not even a contest. Yeah. So I look at that and I think that's kind of done in many ways. That's not going to go away. It's going to be a major problem. But that as the sort of organizing principle of the regime, I think, is done. Those people are not going to regain supremacy. At the same time, there remains very sharp, and whether this is sort of within the Republican Party or whether it's a new left, sort of unclear exactly how that plays out. But the left isn't going to go away. And I just think it's going to it'll probably be a more masculine left. The two that I see is the natural two possibilities I see, and I'm always interested in sort of playing out what else this could look like. One is the Luigi left. And that's a very natural one. It's sort of, it is much more radical. It has lots of antecedent in history of radicals willing to go just shoot and assassinate people, bomb, terrorism. Left has done this throughout history. Sure. So I think one interesting thesis is you actually see a bunch of the sort of the elites of the legacy regime amp up rhetoric that encourages that and really justifies that in the name of democracy, justifies that in the name of sort of progressive science. And you combine that with a class of guys like Luigi, right? Young men willing to actually use violence. And that's been a classic formula. I mean, that was a formula you saw for decades leading up to the Russian Revolution, sort of formula you saw in, Spain in the 30s, formula you saw in the US at various times.
Marx and Lenin specifically call out once you have a destabilizing regime, go after the dissatisfied, disgruntled young men and weaponize them.
They will be willing to engage in violence. So that's one scenario. I think another scenario is sort of an egalitarian transhumanism. And that one would try to it would be a much more digital age vision of what remains the sort of driving, really a utopian project. So it'll be in some sense disconnected from human reality. It'll be egalitarian. It'll be probably disconnected as a transhuman project, disconnected very explicitly from the limitations of the physical world, the limitations of the human condition of our bodies. And it could have sort of varying degrees. In many ways, I think that's sort of a broader landscape. The other one's a very sort of reactive revolutionary force. It's just, classically shoot the rich. That's sure. You don't actually need much more of an animating ideology than that. Resentment, classic resentment. Yeah. The other one, I think, has a broad range of ways that it could play out. And so it's an interesting one to watch, and it could often develop out of things that aren't necessarily sort of seen as clearly on the left today. But I would say it's absolutely one to watch out for, because I think and I would say that one ultimately is the stronger one. I think the revolutionary one can do a lot of damage, but I don't think that it has ultimately Marxism tied itself to a sort of materialistic vision that actually tied itself to the ascendant bureaucratic regime and was able to gain power through that. So Stalin industrialized his country and really turned it into a place that was at the forefront of adopting some of these bureaucratic technologies that were ascendant in that era. The ascendant technology in our era is going to be these digital age networks, digital age bots of various sorts. And so that's ultimately, I see the transhuman one is probably driving the future of what something on the left looks like.
Yeah, and it's a sort of transnational breaking down of the material.
Yes.
Yeah. So if those are the potential paths on the left, what do you see as the opportunities on the right for those private, public, where are the places to build?
So far more, a very, very interesting question. I think it's really the question of our time. And it's not just the question of our time, it's the question that we're particularly focused on. Again, I think that what's happening in DC, extremely exciting, will continue at a rapid pace, will rapidly change the country. But ultimately, a lot of what that'll serve to do is it'll make room for institutions that actually shape the answer to your question, the shape a vision on the right. And when I say on the right, I think the best question here is, what is not utopian? What is grounded in a proper understanding of human nature? Like we don't need to think of it in as explicitly ideological terms. We just need to think of it as grounded in reality. I would say sort of, I think the lines I've used is the human, the local, the timeless, things that are part of our civilization, will continue our civilizational heritage, and really are what it means to be human itself. And those are in some sense, those are entrepreneurial questions. In some sense, they're timeless. You want to look at a proper understanding of human nature, a proper understanding of community. When I say the local, I think like human relationships, trust. There's elements of those that will be the exact same now as were 5,000 years ago. But there's elements of those that there's sort of central questions around how those dynamics are navigated, sort of social norms, cultural norms, that will be profoundly shaped by, that were in many ways sort of largely erased by liberalism. So liberalism did a lot to erase a lot of the traditions of our culture, many of which I think is sort of the trust in these and replace them with these large institutions. Mm-hmm. As those institutions fade, I think one of the first opportunities is to actually reclaim things that are in fact timeless, reclaim things where the skeleton remains. It's not something where we have to rebuild it from scratch. It's part of our cultural heritage, even if it's diminished. And can we build on that? So one of the top ones I keep thinking about is just church communities. So often, and it's other local communities as well, but I use church as a great example because there tends to be there's necessarily both a geographic alignment. You actually go into the same place every week, so that's a certain cadence. And there's actually a values and cultural alignment. Varying degrees, but that's a certain type of community that actually has the seeds of rebuilding lots of trust and sort of, I think, building on that community to actually recreate lots of functions in a very human and human person to person way that have been more recently taken by institutions, but are going to be relinquished by those big bureaucratic institutions. So I think there's interesting opportunities around things like that. There's also very interesting opportunities around what the nature of the digital age. I mean, I think James Poulos has always talked about catechizing the bots. I think that's a central question. Huge elements of our lives are going to be mediated by algorithms, and a central question becomes, what are the values of those algorithms? What is the religion of those algorithms? How are they catechized? So I think that those are kind of the two, what can actually be rebuilt in those human interactions, often probably drawing on timeless traditions or established longstanding cultural traditions in line with timeless values, and in some cases sort of adapting them to different modes of communication, right? Modes of communication affect everything from sort of how far of a distance, how much distance actually matters. And then the second one is really the nature of the digital layer and the nature of the values of the digital layer. And I think that's where catechizing the bots, I would say that's where things like Bitcoin come in. What is the nature of the sort of primary media of exchange, and how is trust tokenized in meaningful ways? Those questions are highly abstract in many ways compared to stuff that we dealt with in the past, and they'll profoundly shape the interaction of the coming era.
Yeah, and as a double clicking on that, as a venture firm, what do you see as the opportunities and the opportunities coming up in this new regime?
So I think the most interesting opportunity is simply that the greatest founders of our era are going to be drawn to these questions. Like everyone recognizes, in many ways, when I would say we were a political firm 4 years ago, people immediately sort of characterize that as, oh, so you're building like election technology or something. Very, very narrow view of what political meant. Now I think it's very clear that, I mean, just looking at the Musk acquisition of Twitter and things, and looking at this new coalition, these are questions of profound importance to the country, to the world. And the greatest founders are going to look at those. And the greatest founders are driven by this desire to build something great, by the desire to solve the biggest problems of our era. So I think as a venture firm, what's interesting is, first off, I think we know how to think in a cross-disciplinary way. and it not just about technology, but about culture and politics and civilization, about what people are really concerned about. And I think that the greatest founders will also be thinking about those questions, and we'll know how to, we'll both know how to recognize that. We'll also really have a sense of how to partner with them, how to sort of be partners in solving this problem. So that I think is at a venture level as an investor, that's the best opportunity. Ultimately, I think that outweighs any sort of specific thematic investing, because a great founder by nature is often going to be thinking outside of an established sort of thesis as well. That's what makes them such a great founder. Now, we also have some of our own theses, and those can be expressed through projects that we're doing directly. So on the real estate side, for instance, what we're doing with the Highland Rim project, what we're doing with local community is actually an effort to actually realize in one particular domain where I think we have a particular advantage, we have particular expertise. I have some background in real estate. We actually have the ability to solve something, and solving it in a way that probably wouldn't make sense for a venture-backed startup by itself. It's a different capital structure to actually solve what for many people is actually the central question of this era, which is the question of what that local life looks like. Housing costs are obviously a massive question, who your neighbors are, the rootedness of local community, the ability to build institutions where you actually see them in a world where there's sort of disruption and chaos in the digital layer, that ability to offer stability in the local layer, built around something that you really want to go long on, I think is a major problem. And so that's one that we're addressing directly. So I think what you'll see is a very strong opportunism about what we invest in, ultimately just gravitating toward people who understand the scale and scope of these problems and opportunities, and then some specific theses like that. And we have a couple of others that we're working on. They're in that space that kind of directly attempt to solve dynamics that are key here. I would say things like mentioning what the nonprofit's not a for-profit endeavor, but it's designed to catalyze action at a layer that we see as an important layer for solving these problems.
Yep. It's good to be moving away from the consumer SaaS age and into the civilizational bets age.
Exactly.
Yeah. Awesome. Good stuff, Nate. Good to have you on the pod again.
Good conversation.
Yeah.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the New Founding Podcast. New Founding has become a rallying point for founders and investors who are taking serious bets in the face of a stagnant business culture. Our venture fund backs founders building dynamic companies, powered by American ideals and a positive national vision. These are the kinds of founders that embody the optimism and competence of the people who come on this podcast. If you're interested in investing in our fund, check out newfounding.com/venture fund and follow the link to apply.